So to kick off the summit, we have an OG IE in journalism researcher for you. He has been in the field long before the hype started, and he authored the book Automating the News: How Algorithms Are Rewriting the Media in 2019. His blog, Generative AI in the Newsroom, is a must-follow, described as an effort to collaboratively figure out how and when, or when not, to use generative AI in news production. Drawing upon his vast research experience and unique international outlook on the topic, he will give us a keynote on the future of generative AI in the newsroom. In journalism, sorry. Please welcome Professor at Northwestern University, Diakopoulos.
Thanks so much for the introduction, and thanks everyone. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation to speak today. I have to say I'm really excited to be back. I was here last year, and it was probably the best event I attended last year, so really happy to be back. So I'm Nick. I'm a professor in communication studies and computer science at Northwestern University. I also have a Nordic connection, so I'm an associate professor at the University in Bergen in Norway. I run the Generative AI Newsroom blog. But today, I'm here to tell you a little bit about the generative future of journalism. So let's get right into it. If you're in this room, I probably don't need to catch you up on all of the hype and buzz that's been happening on generative AI in the last year. You've heard about OpenAI, you've heard about Anthropic, you've heard about Google, and their integration of generative AI into search. You maybe even heard about some of the startups in this space: Perplexity, Pi, the Arc browser, all developing new products and experiences in this space. I can't recount all of the last year to you, either in the space of markets, of the market of products, or in the market of research. Here's a chart showing the explosion of research on the archive preprint server related to generative AI, roughly at the rate of 30 to 40 research papers per week now. But amidst all this growth and hype, I think there's a driving need to try to figure out what's going to happen next. Where is this all going? And my talk today is going to be oriented around where I think generative AI is going to take us in news media and journalism. I'm going to lay out the news production value model, talk about the strategic space there. And then I'm going to ground some of my observations in a recent survey that we collaborated with the Associated Press to run, and talk about how that suggests some indicators for where we might be heading in the future. And then I'm going to also tap into some anticipatory scenario writing research that we've been doing to try to get a broader view of where things might be heading in the future with generative AI. Okay, so let's get into it. And it's a little washed out here, but here's the simplified view of the activities of news production that most media organizations engage with in order to create value. They gather information, they analyze, interpret, and create content. They then distribute that content in order to try to capture attention, which they monetize typically through subscription or advertising. I think what's interesting to recognize here is that the value created by this process can accrue to any of several different stakeholders, right? So we've got journalists, media owners, individuals, and society. Those are a few of the stakeholders that might accrue value through this news production chain. And of course, generative AI, depending on how it's managed and used, can accrue value in different ways to different stakeholders. So I think the management dimension here is very important in terms of who actually captures the value from the technology. If we orient to things like efficiency, then we can imagine journalists capturing value in terms of being able to accomplish their work more quickly, in terms of reducing labor costs creating value for media owners. If we orient towards individual information consumers and audience members and look at their uses and gratifications of the media, then we're creating value there. And if we think about how to use the technology to enhance social progress, society, orienting more towards things like democratic process to perhaps enhance accountability journalism, then we can imagine the value accruing to society. So I think one question you could ask here is, how is generative AI going to impact value creation for each of these different activities and stakeholders? And actually, we have some very fresh data that I think can speak to this question. So we collaborated with the Associated Press and ran a survey in December of 2023. In fact, you should be able to get the report on the survey from this URL in the corner here. If for some reason you can't get it there, it's also on my website under the publications page. Just launched this morning. So this was a collaboration between AP, Northwestern University, and also the University of Amsterdam. I mentioned we did this in late 2023. We got about close to 300 responses. Mostly editors and executives, also reporters, technologists, and some other folks like product managers and so on. And already about 3/4 of respondents said that they're using generative AI in some way in their newsroom. Okay, let's get into this. So we asked respondents about their current use of generative AI, but we also asked about their aspirational use of generative AI. How would you like to be able to use generative AI if it could produce a quality response, a quality output? And the most predominant use cases for generative AI include various forms of textual content production, unsurprisingly. Things like headlines, social media, newsletters, quizzes, taglines, and so on. But information gathering and sense making was kind of second place there. So that's things like news discovery, research, brainstorming, curating. We also see interest in multimedia content production, image editing primarily, and illustration. And also business use cases, emails, SEO, marketing material, and so on. Aspirationally, people kind of expanded had increased interest in areas like information gathering and sense making. So you can see it goes from 21.5 up to 34.9%. So a lot of people interested aspirationally in how can we use this technology to enhance news gathering. Also interest in using it more for working with data, using it more for business use cases, for metadata creation, and also some increased interest in exploring new experiences with things like chatbots and content personalization. But I think the overall pattern that I want to emphasize in this data is that most of the attention from our respondents is on improving and making existing workflows more efficient, with considerably less attention given towards innovating new experiences that might produce new value for individuals or society. Okay, so the high-level implication here, I think, is that journalists really want the value from generative AI to accrue to them, to make their work more efficient and easy, and perhaps at the end of the day to perhaps accrue value to owners, media owners as well, but less so value to individuals or society. And I think the interest and focus on using generative AI for news gathering that I pointed out suggests an emphasis on using it in that content stage. And to me, that focus on news gathering is perhaps an underexploited possibility here, an avenue to find value in journalism and news production that value can, I think, accrue to journalists and owners. And I also think it warrants pointing out the broader strategic environment here. So news organizations used to own distribution, right, until the platforms came along and kind of like chiseled away at that. And now I think what we're seeing is generative AI moving into this middle block, content production, and it's going to start disintermediating news producers in terms of the actual production of content that audiences are exposed to. So we see, experiences like generative AI search, Perplexity, Arc Browser, disintermediating news organizations in content production. And so perhaps focusing on information gathering in terms of an ability to gather unique and exclusive information may be kind of the corner of production that news organizations get pushed into in terms of the larger dynamics of the ecosystem. And maybe it could be strategically valuable to focus on that, to get really good at how to use this technology for news gathering. And maybe that could be traded up the value chain in terms of production and distribution. But I think that's a strategic question for media organizations. Do you want to get pushed into this corner? How much of these other components of news production do you really want to try to maintain and be competitive in? Okay, so another question that we asked in this survey was, would you want help from AI if it could actually do a good job in helping you? And most people indicated that they would actually want help, actually about 50%, half of the respondents. And it's all about augmentation, right? It's about a technology that can help you do your job better. It's about transforming the task into an easier task, more of an oversight task or a review task. Some people were still on the fence, not sure about the capability and the accuracy of the models, fear of becoming dependent on the technology. And then finally, a smaller group, 18% of respondents, said, no way, I don't want help from AI in terms of, we asked them to pick a specific task when they were answering this question. So I don't want help on this task from the AI. And the reasons for that were the technical capabilities still fall short. There's issues of performance, accountability, lack of humanness to the responses, and really just lack of clarity on whether or not there's enough of a payoff in terms of the time that you would need to put in to use the technology. In the yes category, I think it's also important to mention, we had some other evidence in the survey when we asked about strategies for responsible use of generative AI in journalism. And in response to that question, we had about 15% mentioned that they thought verifying the output and having oversight of the content was very important, and another 10% thought that maintaining kind of oversight of the tools was important for responsible use. And so in terms of this yes category, it seems like adopting and using in a responsible sense generative AI is going to need some component of oversight of interface or a way for journalists to essentially edit the content that these systems are creating. I think this can be done by focusing on things like user interface design. To create and enable human oversight, you're going to need to think about efficient interfaces that help engender confidence in the quality of the output from these models and the ability to verify the output. So here's an example from Salesforce research, actually. They've designed a tool called InkSync that has executable editing operations that allow you to more easily track and approve or dismiss suggestions from an LLM. It's sort of generative AI track changes interface. And they've also built a really interesting conceptual model that they call warn, verify, and audit that they support in the interface. And that's basically there to help you track new information that an LLM has added to a text that you're editing, and then include tools for search to help you verify that content, and then a separate interface for auditing so that another person, an editor, can come in after the writer of the content and verify all of the information that's been added from the LLM, all with provenance so you can see where it came from. And in an evaluation with users, they found that the tool could reduce inaccuracies introduced by LLMs into edited text by about 3/4. So I think there's some glimmer of hope here for how we can build interfaces that augment human capability to also account for the limitations of the technology. We also, from the survey, we know that journalists still very much see themselves as editors and checkers of the outputs of generative AI, which makes me optimistic about tools like this. But I think there's a lot of opportunities in this room to think about how you would design interfaces and tools to support this, and also incorporate more of a journalistic approach to attacking the problem. And I think this could accrue value not only to journalists by improving their efficiency, but maybe also to individuals in society in terms of raising the level of quality overall of the content produced here. About half of the respondents in the AP survey indicated that tasks or workflows have already changed due to generative AI. And it's clear that it's already changing the structure and the organization of work in newsrooms. But I think it's less clear whether it's really leading to the kinds of performance gains that have been hyped. There have been a few management studies suggesting that there could be some performance gains here. But I think what the survey makes clear is that there's a lot of variance across different tasks, and there's still a fair bit of uncertainty about what the actual performance gains are. So if journalists are focused on efficiency, it's not yet entirely clear what the efficiency narrative is there, and whether that's really compelling across a range of news tasks. Sure, generative AI can help for things like AI in Photoshop can save time, but it's less clear that the time spent trying to find the perfect prompt to extract something from a document leads to a substantial efficiency gain. Basically, I think the finding is that the perceived efficiency gains are variable across context, and that we're going to need additional research. Sorry, that's my job in academia. Additional research to evaluate whether or not these performance gains are real across a range of tasks. I also want to pick up on this keyword of evaluation here, because I think it's really crucial to establishing the value proposition to guide news organizations through generative AI. We're going to need to be able to evaluate whether a model creates actual value for journalists, owners, individuals, society. We've been thinking about that in my lab. We actually published a workshop paper recently. You can grab that on my website if you're interested. But we think evaluation should focus on three areas that I think align with value creation. The first being output quality. We've got to have a serious conversation in the industry about evaluating the quality of content. If we're talking about trying to differentiate what's going to be the commodity content produced by LLMs, the content that people are going to see at the top of their search results, we've got to be able to have a clear definition of how does journalistic content produced by traditional news organizations vary in quality, and along what dimensions, and by how much from that commodity LLM content. So as generative AI is scaled up to produce more and more content online, I think that differentiation is going to be super important. So we've got to come together and define that in clear ways that we can measure. And also measure in ways that are meaningful to audiences. The second point is that I think we've got to talk about interaction. This is especially crucial, I think, for thinking about the value created for end users who are interacting with generative AI. So are chatbots actually the right interface? Are they creating value for end users? Is an important question to ask. But also, what's the experience that is going to create values? What's the interface that's going to create value for journalists in terms of their own production? And then finally, I think we've got to talk about whether the ethics of the generative AI particular models align with the principles and values of journalism. So talking about, traditional values, pursuit of truth, independence, focus on accountability and transparency, and a range of other news values you might talk about. We need to think about how we're evaluating models to the extent that they align with those values or not. Now, one of the limitations of relying on surveys so much for this kind of information, and really kind of focusing on industry professionals to think about how the information ecosystem is changing and evolving, is that it can be narrowly limited by expert bias. And so to address that, we've been pursuing more of a participatory foresight approach, where we try to bring in a wider range of voices to help think through how is generative AI going to impact society, individual information production, and societal implications. And so there's many different ways you can pursue participatory foresight. One approach that we've been pursuing is developing basically large-scale scenario writing surveys, where we run a survey, we ask people to write a scenario about, for instance, how generative AI will impact the information ecosystem, or how chatbots like ChatGPT are going to create benefits or harms for them. And the task might look something like this, where you kind of set it up, you define the technology, you define what you want them to do, and then you give them about 30 minutes to write a short scenario. And to connect back to the value model I was talking about before, again, I think this is helpful for thinking through the value, both positive and negative, for different stakeholders. So when you have a very diverse range of people writing scenarios, they're exploring lots of different perspectives and lots of different stakeholders who might benefit or have their experience reduced because of generative AI. Based on the scenarios that were written, you can start pulling out themes, which can suggest various opportunities, hopes and fears, can be translated into strategic opportunities for designing things. In this particular exercise, the scenarios were focused on potential negative impacts, and you can see a whole range of things going on here: implications for well-being, labor, a whole host of implications for media quality, but also societal concerns, implications for politics or social cohesion. Again, many of these suggest opportunities for news organizations to think through, how could I create positive social value or guard against potential negative social erosion of social value from content? In another iteration of the scenario writing survey we ran around chatbots to see the distinction between how people were talking about desirable versus undesirable outcomes from things like ChatGPT. And it was very interesting kind of analyzing these scenarios, because you could kind of see people talking about individual impacts, societal impacts, desirable and also undesirable. So we can look at something like individual desirable impacts that people talked about, potential value for mental well-being, companionship, knowledge, learning, and information consolidation. That sounds like an opportunity for news organizations, but also help with tasks in everyday life. In terms of the societally desirable outcomes, people mentioned social cohesion, multiculturalism, and perhaps reduced inequality, although only 5% of scenarios mentioned those kinds of things. We also saw people mentioning individual undesirable outcomes, loss of creativity or critical thinking skills, negative performance from accuracy issues with the models, over-reliance, potential for misconduct and cheating, and so on. And then societally undesirable outcomes, things like, how is this going to impact the economy or unemployment? Is this going to lead to tech dependence? Is this going to lead to misinformation and erosion of trust, a loss of humanness or the human touch in society? And I think it's interesting, you can see that we found a larger proportion of undesirable impacts described at the societal level than at the individual level. So it's also interesting to see that people are focusing more on potential negative societal consequences of these technologies. But people generally have a lot of positive affect toward things like ChatGPT and its potential for individual gain. And I think there's also an interesting contrast here to the data I showed you from the AP survey in terms of, when you ask journalists to their opinion on this, they'll mostly talk about how to make news production more efficient. But as you see, there's a much larger landscape there of opportunity and possibility, and also challenges, which I think create or can be generative for creating value through new products. And of course, it's important to remember with scenarios, this is all based on foresight. So these things, and to some extent, haven't materialized yet. And that connects back to my point about evaluation. We're going to need to go through and be evaluating these, whether or not they actually materialize. And of course, not all of these opportunities will be opportunities for news organizations, but I think they might point the way towards various user needs that perhaps are addressed by other kinds of actors in the media ecosystem. We can also go even bigger in terms of our scenario writing. So the Open Society Journalism Futures Project ran a scenario writing program about the impact of AI on the information ecosystem. They were kind enough to share the anonymized mini scenarios that they collected from close to 900 people from around the world so that I could do some analysis on those scenarios. And I think one of the dimensions that's interesting about how they framed their challenge is that they asked scenario writers to identify end states, sort of like the final outcome, where is this all heading? And I should say that my analysis of this data is still ongoing. And of course, I'm trying to use generative AI to help with the analysis, because 900 scenarios is a lot. So what I've done is I've used an LLM to extract the end state from these mini scenarios, and then I've been manually clustering them to try to find themes. And at a very high level, I can say there's a really rich array of visions of the future that people see emerging as a result of generative AI in the media. And there's substantial disagreement, too. Not everyone thinks it's utopia or dystopia. There's a lot of stuff in the middle. And for everyone who thinks that GenAI is going to create a disinformation hellscape, there's another set of people who think it's going to totally empower fact-checking and lead to a better, more higher quality information system. So my analysis of the end states spanned different levels. At the level of content production, we see outcomes related to content and quality enhancement of things like investigative journalism. We see potential changes to coverage, like the empowering of marginalized voices or enhanced participatory journalism. And we see a lot of shifts in news work, in gathering and analysis, the rise of influencers, and the hybridization of news work with AI. At the audience level, we see how generative AI will change user experiences and the consumption and reception of information. There's also a lot of attention given to personalization and what that's going to do to the audience experience, and how that will increase relevance for individuals and value for individuals. At the ecosystem level, it's about institutional change. It's about AI dominance related to the outsized role of AI that AI will play in media, and who's going to control that power. Is it going to be big tech controlling that? Is it going to be governments, authoritarians, and so on? And I think there's also a lot of hand-wringing here around things like information integrity, things like sensationalism, truth and trust erosion, and so on. And then finally, at the societal level of end states, there's focused on the impact of fundamental rights and democratic process, on policy and governance, fragmentation issues of polarization, inequality in the digital divide, and how ultimately generative AI is going to impact communities. Now, a few of the trends that are a bit more tech-driven here are about things like how sourcing may change and whether or not we're going to start simulating sources. Like, could I simulate myself as a source, and then you can just interview the simulated Professor Diakopoulos? That's an interesting thing to play with. Or what happens when we release autonomous agents on large document corpora? How does that change news production? Lots of interesting stuff to play with here. And there's a lot to take in. And I'm still at the beginning of digesting all this material myself. But I would say that there's a lot of room to think about value creation here for individuals, for the ecosystem, for society. I think like the exercises like the one OSF is running, like the kinds of research that we're working on, scenario building, can be very generative for strategic thinking in the field. And hopefully, this gives you some food for thought in that direction. So I'm just going to close things down. Basically, just to wrap things up, I think that there's a need to think about requirements in a human-centered way, surveys, scenarios, other methods to understand what real people want and need from generative AI. Let's think less about journalists as the only stakeholder and more about how we're going to create value for individuals and society. And let's think about designing new experiences. Let's not make it all about efficiency, but think about prototyping and experimenting and testing new models for creating value for individuals and society, new interfaces, new products, and let's evaluate them so that we can actually demonstrate whether and how that value materializes. So I will wrap it up there, and I'm happy to take questions if we have time, but thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. Very interesting. We're running a bit over time, but I think we have time for just a few questions. I was just wondering about the scenario writers. First, I was wondering, were they using GenAI to write their scenarios? Maybe. But then, is it mostly just heaven or hell when you write a scenario? Could it be just in this future, AI is this helpful but mundane tool that I use for all my boring tasks? Any of that?
Yeah, we see a lot of stuff in between. It's not all utopia versus dystopia. I think the interesting thing from a lot of the scenarios is that people have very nuanced views of how this is all going to play out from their particular perspective on the world. In terms of whether or not people use GenAI, in our research, we try to screen for that pretty carefully. We have a bunch of checks that we put in place to try to make sure they're human-generated scenarios.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Then I get to throw a ball, as you know. Yes, we have one here. All right, let's see how it goes.
Perfect.
Hi, I'm Marcus from SVT. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was just wondering, when you were talking about research and collecting information, you said, do you want to be pushed into that corner? I just wonder, what do you mean by get pushed into that corner? Can you elaborate, please?
My sense is that the tech companies are the platforms kind of first encroached on distribution, and the tech companies, the AI companies, I think are now encroaching on the content production. So I see that as kind of compressing or pushing news media away from distribution and production towards gathering. And I don't necessarily know if that's where they want to be. I think there's potentially also opportunities to differentiate how tech companies are doing content production using LLMs versus how news organizations want to use it. And part of my pitch around a focus on evaluation and looking at quality is to help with that differentiation, because I think you're going to have a lot of low-quality commodity content that's LLM produced. And then the question is, how do you differentiate the journalistic content? Along which dimensions can you measure and show that, yes, our content is demonstrably different and better than the commodity LLM content?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I was just about to say, you have to hold it really close to your mouth. Now.
Roger.
Yeah, Roger. Okay. I'm sorry, but that was all the questions we had time for now. Let's give a big hand to Nick.
Thank you very much.
Great presentation.